I couldn't find a good video for protists online, so I thought I'd just make one myself. The next kingdom of living things that we're going to talk about here, we've already talked about bacteria, but we're going to talk about protists. And protists it's a really varied group. If you've ever seen the old cartoon that was made years and years ago called Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, when the dentist and he went off on their little adventure, they ended up on an island called the Island of Misfit Toys. And it was just a place for all the things that didn't fit in somewhere else, like a jack-in-the-box without a crank and a train with square wheels and a plane that couldn't fly. All the things that didn't fit in with the other toys ended up on this island of misfit toys. Well, that's sort of what you got here with the Protist Kingdom. It's hard to say what a normal protist looks like because there are so many different ones. And they're in this category because they simply didn't fit in somewhere else. There are three major types of protists. There are animal-like ones, plant-like ones, and fungus-like ones. So some of them act like a plant. They get the energy from the sun, but they don't qualify as plants because they may not have true root stems and leaves, or they may not even be multicellular. Some of them are animal-like, and they move around and they eat other stuff, but again, they're usually one cell big, and most animals are not that, so they're not in the animal group. And then there are some that decompose dead stuff from the environment, almost like a fungus does. But again, they're not multicellular. So they don't really fit into the fungus category, but they do release spores like a fungus. So they've put them into this one group altogether called the protist group. It's kind of a catch-all for everything. So I'd like to show you a little bit more about each type, and we'll talk about some specific things that some of them can do. The first group here are the plant-like ones, and these are photosynthetic like a plant. They don't have true root stems and leaves. Most of them live in the water, like the little Mosimo balls here that you can buy at the pet store and put down in your fish tank. Those are really cool. They grow over time and they're made of algae. There is kelp or seaweed out of the ocean, and you eat that more often than you think you do. There's seaweed in your toothpaste usually as a thickening agent, and you eat it if you eat sushi at the Japanese restaurants. There are some plant-like protists that are much smaller than that, though. Now, the seaweed we just looked at can get like 100-foot tall down under the water. But most of the plant-like protists are single-celled, and there's things like algae, which most people would just call pond scum, that green, slimy-looking stuff in the bottom of ponds and creeks. And then one of my absolute favorite ones, this one here called Volvox, and it's another photosynthetic group of cells that live in pond water. And when you look at it, you think, well, that's one circular organism, but that's not true. Inside that circle, each one of the little dots that you see is an entire organism all in of itself. And they're sort of like cooperating. They're kind of holding each other's hands in a circle to make a 3D sphere. And inside of that major sphere, little ones can form called daughter colonies, and then they can break out and form completely new volvox. That's how they reproduce. So that volvox is a really cool one. It's one of my favorite ones. Now, there are also animal-like protists. And one of the most common ones that you see, even on like the state test, you'll see this one, is called a paramecium. Now, all of the animal-like ones will move around and eat things. So they're sort of like an animal, but they're also just one cell big. And they're usually classified based on how they move around, like the little paramecium that we're looking at here. You can ignore all these other labels and things, but just look at this one here. These little hairs around the entire outer surface of the paramecium are called cilia, and they operate like little oars on a rowboat or something. If it wants to move forward, it'll fan them backwards. If it wants to back up, it'll fan them forwards. And it can turn. They can actually move really fast with those things if you're trying to keep up with one under a microscope. There are some others. This is a euglena. Now, this little guy's weird. It is an animal-like protist, but it can also photosynthesize. But when the sun's not out, it can chase things down and eat them. And it does that with a little whip-like tail that it has called a flagella. And that one, on this one, it's on the head end of the little euglena, so it kind of pulls itself along with it. On some others, it's on the tail end. The other one that's very common is an amoeba. And this thing is sort of like just a blob. It doesn't have like a defined shape to it. It just kind of blobs around, and it can change its shape constantly. And when it moves, it extends these little stretched out portions of its body, kind of forms a blobby arm, if you want to think of it that way, or a blobby foot to move itself around with. And those little blobby stretched out portions are called pseudopod or pseudopoda, if you want to say the plural term. And that means false feet. So it's kind of a fake foot that it's stretching out and then sort of blobbing itself along with. Now, these are some of the reasons that you don't want to drink pond water, because if you get certain ones of these amoebas in your gut, you can get amoebic dysentery, which means you'll be living on the toilet for several days. Can even put you in the hospital. So never drink creek water. So those are the animal-like ones. 3 ways to move: the cilia hairs, the flagella, whip-like tail, and the pseudopoda, the false feet. You'll need to remember those if you choose that as your choice in the assignment today. And then the last category of protist are the fungus-like ones. Now, these didn't quite make it into the fungus category because they're not multicellular. So things like mildew in your shower that's growing off the dead skin that you wash off in your shower, that's not actually a fungus. It's a protist. It's a single-celled little fungus-like organism. And so is slime mold that you see in the forest. Now, I know that looks huge, when you see it, that big blob of yellow-looking jelly-like substance. It looks like it's a pretty big organism, but that's actually millions and millions of tiny little single-celled protists hanging onto each other again. They're kind of cooperating, but they're not one thing. You can pull each one apart, and it'll just keep right on living. Now, these things decompose dead stuff, and they release spores just like a fungus does, and that's why they're in the fungus-like protist category. So that's the island of misfit organisms, the Protist Kingdom. And that's most of the information that you'll need for this category for the assignment. All right. See you later.